Hello and welcome. Welcome to the Introduction to IVF Masterclass. So I am just going to get started by sharing my screen and saying welcome everybody. Let's see, share my screen. Bear with me a second while I get it going. Here we go. There we go. All right. Welcome to the Introduction to IVF. So my name is Bianca Campbell, and I want to tell you quickly who this presentation or masterclass is for. So this masterclass is for women who are new to IVF. So if you've been labelled with a diagnosis of infertile, you've been trying to conceive for more than 12 months, perhaps you've already started the process with a specialist, this masterclass will teach you as much as I know and can share about IVF from a non-clinical perspective, very much from a layperson perspective, to put it in your terminology, so you understand what's to come. This is also for partners that are new to IVF, just so they are aware of what you are going to go through as you journey through IVF. And for anyone just wanting a basic introduction to what is IVF all about, what's the outcome going to be? You know, what's the chances of your outcome going to be? Obviously, you know what your outcome you'd like it to be. It's a baby at the end of it. But what does the process look like? And what are your chances of it working for you? And what are some challenges and things that you should know along the way? So that's what we're going to work through today in this masterclass. So, I've lost the about me. About me. So I am a fertility coach and a kinesiologist. I won't go into that in too much detail. Suffice to say that kinesiology is an energetic alternative model of healing. And obviously I'm a fertility coach and I have a background for myself in infertility issues. Hence I took this area, my area of training of kinesiology, and decided to apply it to women who are trying to conceive, who are going through IVF, and who are pregnant through IVF. I actually have 2 children that were created via an egg donor. So I have the experience of that. I didn't use my own eggs due to my own fertility diagnosis, which was premature ovarian failure. People sometimes call it premature menopause. That happened when I was around 24, 25. So I had quite a few years to catch up to speed with what the challenges were. And when I met my husband, we very quickly moved on to IVF with an egg donor, and my children are now 5 and almost 3. So I know what the process is like, although I haven't done egg retrieval myself. We'll talk about that very soon. I've been through the rest of the process. Okay, so let's move on. So know your chances of conception through IVF. It's really important before you start that you understand the statistics. If you're already seeing a clinic, they may have given you their statistics and they will paint them in the light that it serves them the best. I want you to have a realistic understanding, not to say that you can't be optimistic through the process, but I want you to have an understanding that flows with reality. I'm just going to turn my phone on to silent just in case it starts ringing. Okay, so these statistics I've presented here on the screen are from the 2019 Australia and New Zealand Assisted Reproduction Report. So all of the clinics in Australia and New Zealand basically gave all of their data for the year of 2019 through to an organisation that created a report based on all that data. So this gives you an idea of what every single woman going through the process in that year in the 2 countries, what the chances of success were, what the actual reality of success was for them per cycle. Now, one of the most important things I want you to understand is that your age impacts the likelihood of success using your own eggs. So up until the age of around 35, you've got the highest level of fertility in that time frame. And obviously it depends on your individual circumstances. But as a general rule, up to age of 35 is when you're at your most fertile. After 35, it starts to drop off. So the women in this particular year in Australia and New Zealand who were ages 35 to 39 had a 24% chance of having a live birth rate per cycle. So what that means is every IVF cycle that was started that year by a woman who was either in the age range of 35 to 39, she had a 24% chance of getting pregnant and having a baby at the end of the process of that actual one cycle. So moving over here to the side of the screen, that means that 76% of those women ages 35 to 39 in 2019 in Australia and New Zealand had a cycle that didn't work. So only 24% of women in that age, in that year, had this one cycle, got a live baby from it. So as you can see, that number is not that high. That's like a quarter of the women who did a cycle in that age range that year got pregnant. And ages 40 to 44 in that same year, only 10% of women using their own eggs had a live birth per cycle. So 90% of the women that were ages 40 to 44 did not get a baby from a cycle in that year. That's a huge number. So what it's saying is, what these numbers are saying is, as a general rule, if you're over 40, your chances have dropped off dramatically. So from ages 35 to 39, you've got a 24% chance per cycle. Ages over 40, it drops down to 10%. And if you're over 44, so 40, 45 and over, it'll be even lower than that. So this all assumes that you're using your own eggs, okay? So this is about your egg age and egg quality at an older age. This is not to say that you cannot get pregnant. Of course, there are women who fall pregnant after this age, but women using IVF in this age range, you've got a lot lower chance, okay? And then I want you to understand the women that have gone before you. So these are the statistics and the chances based on what has happened in women before you in the past. Obviously, this is specific to Australia and New Zealand, but the numbers are replicated at clinics across the world. It's fairly standard for approximately 50% of cycles across all age ranges to be successful, meaning that half of those aren't. So I also want you to know these numbers. So in the same report we were just talking about, so that was 2019 to Australia and New Zealand, all of the IVF cycles across the two countries, there were almost 90,000 cycles in that year. And of that, there were 16,310 babies were born. Obviously, you can't argue with that. That's how many children that were born. So 81% of cycles in that year were unsuccessful across all ages, across all women doing IVF, across both countries. 81% were unsuccessful. That's a really high number of unsuccessful cycles, right? And I also included these other few bits of information for your awareness. So this next statistic, the live birth rate per fresh cycle was 16.5%. So let's break that down. So a fresh cycle is when you use your eggs. So you do an egg retrieval, and I'm going to explain the whole process shortly. You do an egg retrieval to remove eggs from your ovaries. The follicles inside your ovaries, they'll take an egg out, and then they'll attempt to get it to fertilize straight away. And a fresh cycle is when they then use that embryo that's been created from the egg and the sperm together. They'll use it straight away in your body. So within about 5 days of them removing the egg, they will actually go and transfer that embryo back to your womb, back to your uterus. That's called a fresh cycle. So of the fresh cycles that women had, the live birth rate, so the babies that were actually born, the percentage of those cycles, 16.5% was successful. So it's really important that you see this. And then the next statistic. So the live birth rate per frozen or thaw cycle, it's called both things, was 28.9%. So if instead of having a transfer immediately 5 days or so after your egg retrieval, if the embryos are frozen at the 5 to 7 day mark, it's approximate, it's actually about 3 to 7, depending on the clinic. If those embryos are frozen and then you come back again a little bit in the future, maybe it's 1 or 2 cycles ahead, your chance of a live birth increases dramatically to almost 30%. So it's actually almost a doubling of chances of success. And that's why a lot of clinics these days are preferring a frozen transfer. There's no specific reasoning attached to it, but it's likely to be because egg retrieval takes a whole lot of energy from your body. More than 1 egg is retrieved, multiple, as many as your body will get ready. And that puts a big pressure on your body to remove those and then to go straight into trying to get pregnant. So I imagine, and don't quote me on it, but I would imagine that statistic is suggesting that it is not the best thing to go straight from egg retrieval to a fresh cycle. To maximize your chances, it's giving your body a little bit of a break to heal a little bit from the extra work it has to do to produce so many eggs all in one hit based on the drugs, to then push that out and then do a transfer a bit further down the track when your body's had a bit of chance to go back to a bit more of a normal state. The other stat that I wanted to include here is very specific to Australia and New Zealand, but it's relevant for women overseas to understand what is happening in Australia and New Zealand. So Australia and New Zealand have moved away from the multiple embryo transfers. So what that means is that Australians tend now, and New Zealand tend to do a single embryo at an IVF transfer, as to the point of there's 91.9%, almost 92% of transfers now are single embryos, not double. So back in 2015, so that's now about 7 years ago, it was 85%, 85.7%. So it's gone up by about 5 or 6% in that time. So less and less multiple transfers are happening in Australia. And that is because Australia and New Zealand, sorry, I keep forgetting New Zealand. That's because the two countries now believe it's better for maternal health and it's better for outcomes for babies to not have the multiple transfers. And that's a general thing happening in these two countries. And I know it's very different in other countries. So you can ignore that if you like, but understand that that's what's happening in Australia and it's relevant for Australian women and New Zealand women. I keep forgetting New Zealand, just as important in these stats. Okay, let's move right along. Okay, assisted reproduction technology. So now I want to explain to you how it all works when you go to the clinic and what the different levels of intervention are from a medical perspective, but in layman's terms, so that you understand it. So they're going to start with no intervention through to high intervention. Okay, so the first stage of intervention is a natural cycle with no medication. So that's just like if you were trying to get pregnant anyway, with no intervention whatsoever, you just go about your normal thing. A specialist may choose to monitor you. Usually you do this for 12 months before you even get to the point of seeing a fertility specialist. Moving on to the second stage, this is a medicated cycle. So what they will do is they will give you meds to encourage your body to ovulate, to really encourage your ovaries to produce the follicles which contain the eggs, to then release those, and hopefully that will improve your chances of getting pregnant with very little intervention. All you're doing is taking drugs. So when I say all you're doing, obviously it has an impact on you, but we'll talk about that a bit later. This is for understanding a clinic's involvement in your fertility journey. So the third stage of intervention is IUI, intrauterine insemination. It's a bit of a mouthful. So that is where they will actually, your partner will, or the sperm donor will give the sperm sample, and then that will be put inside your womb. And then they'll let it see what happens. Yeah, so it's just a matter of seeing what the response of your body is to the sperm, and hopefully that encourages you to get pregnant. So again, it's a very low level of intervention. Yeah, they don't actually do anything with the sperm. Let me double check my notes, but I'm fairly sure. Yep, oh, they do, sorry. They do wash and concentrate the sperm. So but it's still a low level of involvement. They're not doing any surgery, because obviously a sperm collection is done by the man, it's passed on to the embryologists, they clean the sperm, and then that is put back inside your uterus to see if that encourages, you know, ovulation, and then therefore, well, not encourages ovulation, encourages baby to take, or to be created, embryo to be created. And it's likely that you'll be medicated through that process. And stage 4, this is obviously what this whole masterclass is about: in vitro fertilization, IVF. This is the maximum level of intervention, and obviously there's a lot of procedures that might be involved in this. We will allude to some of them, but I won't go into a lot of detail about the procedures that are involved necessarily, because there's a lot of them depending on what's going on for you in your body. So this is a very simplistic overview of what an IVF cycle looks like. So this is for total rookie who's never done this before, doesn't necessarily understand it, so that you have full awareness of what it looks like. Okay, so we're going to assume that you're using your own eggs. And again, the variations depend on your reason for infertility, your diagnosis, why you've been diagnosed as infertile. Maybe there's genetic issues, maybe you've got endo, maybe you've got PCOS, maybe you're like me and you've got premature ovarian failure. And again, there'll be variations depending on whether you're using donor eggs or your own eggs. Obviously, that changes how the process looks for you specifically, but the process is the same. So if you're using donor eggs, there will still be someone who will be doing the egg retrieval on your behalf. So we start with the first point of contact. That's where you have your specialist appointment, and then maybe multiple. Your clinic may choose to have more than one. They'll generally get your history, understand why you're in this position that you're in. They'll go through all of your medical reports, anything that has, you know, is of relevance to what is happening. So it really depends on your clinic and the doctor and their understanding of what's happened to you. They may or may not set up procedures for you before you proceed to the actual IVF process. But we're not going into that at the moment in this masterclass. This is where I just touch on it, some of the early procedures. And that may be before you start your cycle. So for example, your partner might have sterilization reversed. You might have a lap or a laparoscopy for endometriosis, or they may attempt to reopen your blocked tubes and so on. So that's as far as we're going to talk about that. The next stage will be medications. So you'll begin medications. Again, we're assuming this is a cycle using your own eggs. You'll begin medications to stimulate your ovaries to produce the follicles. So the follicles are like a little fluid sac that contain one egg each. So they'll likely use injections, which you generally do on yourself or your partner does on you. And that will stimulate your ovaries to go, okay, it's time to produce lots and lots of follicles, lots of eggs. And obviously this is not natural. It won't happen in a normal cycle. They'll regularly check your hormones via blood tests. You'll also have ultrasounds, which will monitor your follicles. As I said before, that's where the little eggs or your eggs reside inside those follicles, which are full of fluid as well as the egg. Then the next step is you will inject yourself, or someone will do it for you, with the pregnancy hormone, HCG, to trigger ovulation. So this encourages your body to go, right, it's time to ovulate. It's time to produce the egg, let go of the eggs. It's time. And that will happen between 36 to 38 hours before you go in for the egg retrieval. Usually it's day surgery, and they basically use an ultrasound to guide them to where the follicles are, to remove as many eggs as they possibly can from your ovaries. They may be mature or immature eggs. And that process takes approximately 4 hours, give or take. And on the same day, around the same time, the sperm collection will be provided to the clinic at the same time, so that they can then attempt to fertilize the eggs that they have once they go through the processes of sorting out the eggs and the sperm, which I'll explain in a second. Now, so the next step is fertilization. So wash and separate the sperm, just like we talked about with IUI, except for this is IVF. So they'll wash and separate the sperm out. And then the eggs that they collect are put in a special medium. They'll stay in that medium up until the time they go into your body or are frozen. And if they thaw them, they put them in the same medium. And then if you're choosing or electing to use ICSI, that is where they take a single sperm. So they'll actually fish out a single sperm and they'll inject it specifically into each egg. So that improves the chances of fertilization. So the other way is they just stick all the eggs and all the sperm into one little petri dish and just let them go for it, just as it would if it was inside you in your uterus, if the sperm were in your uterus after ejaculation through sex. So it really depends on which process you choose, which way you want to go with that one. Then they wait and see. So they'll put the dish into an incubator at body temperature, and they'll give the embryos anywhere from 3 to 7 days to develop into an embryo. So they're obviously waiting to see if the eggs fertilize, and B, if they start to grow to a viable blastocyst. So it depends on your clinic. Most clinics will give you an update, firstly, of the number of eggs. You normally wake up with a number on your hand of how many eggs, like they'll write it in Texter often. And then they will, overnight, they'll watch what's happening and they'll let you know in the morning how many actually fertilize. And then over the course of the next, somewhere between 3 and 7 days, they'll let you know how many are, sorry, I missed a step. They'll let you know how many were mature, how many eggs were mature and how many were immature. The immature ones aren't ready to be fertilized, so they'll unfortunately be lost in the process. The mature eggs, they will attempt to fertilize them either with ICSI or they go into the petri dish, and then they wait and see if they fertilize and then how they progress. So what they'll do is they'll look at the size and the shape and the number of cells and cell division within the embryos or the blastocyst to see if they're viable enough to make it and to survive. So then they will tell you how many actually make it all the way through the process and how many embryos you end up with. Then you'll also, at the same time, have your lining monitored. So that's the lining of your uterus to see if it's basically, it needs to be a certain thickness, which is approximately over 7 mils for a successful transfer. They also look at, when I say here weight, they look at what happens with your lining is it will change. It will go, if you look at it on ultrasound, it will go from sort of black to like, it will get a white, almost like a coating, and that's what they're looking for to say that your lining is ready for transfer. So as I mentioned before, you can have a fresh or a frozen transfer. So when you have a fresh transfer, you take the meds while you wait for those embryos to grow, and then any excess embryos are frozen. And then obviously the frozen or the thaw transfer happens at a later date. And through the transfer, it generally happens just in day surgery, kind of like a pap smear. They'll transfer the embryos through to your uterus via a catheter, which goes through your cervix. It feels about the same discomfort as a pap smear because they'll use like a speculum to open up your vagina, and then they will test the size of your cervix to make sure that they've got the right catheter size to then pass that through into your uterus to then release the embryo in. And it's a very gentle process. Some clinics will use ultrasound. When mine were done, it was done just by sight by the doctor. They've got to be very careful that they don't disturb your lining and they don't break your lining, because if they do, that's going to risk the chance of you just going straight to your period, and then the whole process has been a waste of time. So they're very, very gentle, very careful. And some women find it painful. I found it same as a pap smear, fairly just discomfort of having a speculum and, you know, having someone poke around your cervix and your uterus is not much fun, but it's not, from my perspective, it wasn't painful. Some women do find it so I want you to understand it really is up to your individual body, the comfort level. I can't speak for the the egg retrieval process and comfort levels because I haven't had that done myself. Then there'll be what women often call the 2-week wait. So approximately 2 weeks after transfer, you do a pregnancy test. to confirm if you are pregnant. It depends on your clinic's protocols, which day you test and how it's done. Most clinics will send you straight for a blood test. So they test that HCG again, that's human, don't even think I should say it. I'll stick with HCG in your bloodstream to confirm pregnancy. It has to be above at least 5. If it doesn't rise over 100 quickly, they'll tend to say, oh, this might be a chemical pregnancy. The HCG needs to double approximately every 2 to 3 days for the pregnancy to be considered viable. And those numbers increase dramatically. I've seen women start at a very low level and still end up with a healthy pregnancy. And I've seen women who have got quite high numbers and it doesn't proceed. So it can be quite an intense and emotional time waiting to see if you're pregnant and if it's stuck. The one thing I want you to remember is that a woman going through a natural conception doesn't know anywhere near as much as you know when you're going through the IVF process. Because you're monitored the whole way, because you know the day of conception, because you know even sometimes approximately the hour of conception, you know how quickly you are pregnant or not. Women who are going through the natural cycle don't have that awareness. They may be wandering around not even aware they're pregnant for a couple of weeks. So just remember that when you're going through this process, you have got all of this awareness that a woman getting pregnant naturally doesn't have. So be easy about it. Most women get to this point and they don't even know they're pregnant, whereas you know day for day what's going on. My strong recommendation, just while we're here, is don't home test during this time frame. There's plenty of other things that you can do, and we'll probably mention this a little bit later on. There's plenty of other things you can do in that 2-week window. So important things to know as you're going through this process. Be informed. So the more you know, the more realistic your expectations can be. So the more that you can find out about your diagnosis and your condition and why you are where you are, as much as is possible, the more chance that you have to understand what the options are for you. For me, knowing at age 24 that I would likely need donor eggs, while it was very hard to hear at that age, it meant that when it came to it and I started to explore the process of IVF with my now husband, I was already informed. I already knew that was likely going to be the case. So it wasn't such a shock. The shocks are what make this highly stressful for women. And I also want you to know about things like egg attrition rates and follicle attrition rates, so that you understand when you go through this process, and even embryo attrition is probably more correct than egg attrition. I want you to understand when you get to the end of the process that your egg numbers and your embryo numbers may not be what you expected at all. So this is what I mean by attrition of your eggs. So I've put question mark to question mark because every woman is different how many they start with. Firstly, how many follicles can be found in your ovaries is one thing. And then leading to the number of embryos you actually end up with. Whoops, I jumped ahead. So you might have a really high number of follicles and then a high number of eggs that come out. And so you might come out with a high number of embryos from the process, but some women don't. And I also want you to understand that they drop off. So you start with a number of follicles. It's likely, but not always the case, that you will get less eggs than follicles. And most certainly it's likely you'll get less mature eggs than you had follicles through the egg retrieval process. And then the next stage at fertilization, it's likely that not necessarily all of those eggs will fertilize. They might, but then come to the actual number of embryos that make it through to be it 3 to 7 days and they're viable, that number is going to drop again. So to give you a quick example, I had a 20-year-old donor. She gave us 28 eggs on egg retrieval day. Of those, 16 were mature. So there was 12 already gone out of the picture. So 16 fertilized. Sorry, they were mature and they fertilized. So we didn't get a drop then. But there were only 6 that made it all the way through to the 5-day embryo stage. So that went from 28 down to 6. And that is very normal. That is with a 20-year-old donor. You don't get donors that are much younger than that, right? Not many women who are 18 are going to be egg donors. So what I'm saying is, if you're in your 30s or even 40s, don't be surprised if you don't get 28 eggs, and don't be surprised if you don't get even maybe 6 embryos. If you get 6 embryos, that's an amazing number. This is all age-based because your eggs do degrade over time. That's just the reality of fertility, women's fertility. We're in a whole new world with this stuff, right? Okay, it's been going on for quite some time, IVF, but many women don't know that from age 35, your fertility starts to drop. So going back to the attrition, don't be surprised if you don't get as many embryos as you'd hoped for. If you only get a handful, you're doing well. You're doing really well. And I want you to address your emotions as well. This is another important thing to remember. If you're feeling fear about this process, if you're afraid of never getting pregnant, if you're afraid of never being a mother, address them now while you have the time and the space. Bring yourself to calm if you can, peace, anything that's positive. If you can shift those emotions, it's going to put you in a much better place for the pregnancy, for the success of the pregnancy, and then ultimately for the child that is to come. And with this, I speak with experience. I had some underlying anxiety that I didn't fully address while I was pregnant. And that meant that the first few months of my daughter's life was stressful. That anxiety came back. What I found happened was any anxiety that I didn't deal with or negative emotions I didn't deal with just kind of moved from milestone to milestone. So I got pregnant on our first transfer, and that anxiety just shifted to the next thing. First, it's your blood tests, then it shifts to your scans, then it shifts to your next scan. Is baby okay? Then it shifts to when you're pregnant and waiting to see when baby comes. Is baby still okay? And then when baby actually comes, then you've got the reality of dealing with a newborn baby. So if you haven't addressed, say, that anxiety, the anxiety is still there, but now you're a new mother dealing with a newborn on lack of sleep, and the anxiety is still going to present in a different way. So what I'm getting at is deal with that anxiety as soon as you can, or the fear, or whatever the negative emotion is, because you can shift it. And it sets you up in a much better place the sooner you shift it. So let's move on to challenges. I'm just going to grab a drink. Okay, things that I want you to know before you even get to IVF. It will be an emotional roller coaster. Guarantee it. There'll be highs, there'll be lows, and you won't know until you're going through it what's coming next in terms of your emotional response to what's happening. All the women that I've heard from, that I've had any contact with, all the social media groups, everyone agrees IVF is an emotional roller coaster. So the more prepared you are for that, the better. Just checking, I don't have, that's fine. It will be an emotional roller coaster. Expect that. Not knowing is also quite a challenge because it's so unknown in the process. You don't know how many follicles are going to come up. You don't know how many eggs are going to be retrieved. You don't know how many embryos you will get. You don't know if your pregnancy is going to stick. You don't know your beta numbers. You don't know if it's going to double. You don't know what's going to happen when you get to your scans. Are you going to have an actual viable baby in there? Is there going to be a sac in there? Is it going to be in the wrong place? Is it an ectopic pregnancy? Is baby growing at the right size to be considered healthy? Is there a chance of miscarriage? Do you get all the way through the 40 weeks of pregnancy and have a healthy baby at the end? You don't know any of that. It's very stressful not knowing any of that, especially with the amount of energy and time, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, financial, so the cost that's involved. That makes it really stressful. So I will jump to the fourth one, financial. It's a burden. It costs money in most countries, not every country. Some people are very lucky and they get supported by their countries, certainly not in our country, although there's elements of it that are supported financially. The waiting, sorry, I'm jumping backwards a little bit, but the waiting is another challenge. There's waiting to get started. There's waiting to start your meds. There's waiting, there can be waiting to see a specialist just to start with. There's waiting for your period to come. There's waiting, and that's at the beginning. There's waiting for, what's the next bit? Egg retrieval, to see how many follicles you have and then how many eggs there are. There's waiting to see how many are mature. There's waiting to see how many fertilize. There's waiting to see how many make it through to a blastocyst or an embryo that's, that's viable. There's, if you do testing, genetic testing, waiting to see how many are considered normal and how many aren't. Then there's waiting to see if you're actually pregnant through the 2-week wait. I like to call it the 2 weeks of wonder. I have a little program, which I'll mention a bit later. Then there's waiting to see, get through your scans to make sure everything looks good with baby. And then there's waiting to actually, while you're pregnant, to actually have the baby. There's a lot of waiting in this process. Another challenge, relationship pressure. IVF will test your relationship for sure. You will be on a, think of it like when your period comes, how emotional you may or may not get. We know a lot of women do get emotional, have a really hard time around the time of their period. It's like that on steroids, literally, because you are taking drugs through this, and it will put a lot of pressure on your relationship. Even more so if it takes time for you to get pregnant. Okay, so be aware that's a big challenge. Misguided advice is another challenge, and I'm just giggling a little bit thinking about some of the things that people may say to you through this process. When you're struggling with your fertility, they might just say, relax, don't worry about it. Just go and have sex. You'll be fine. You'll get pregnant. It'll happen. Doesn't work like that, right? You know that if you got to the point of IVF, your life hasn't worked that way. And the last generation didn't deal with infertility to the extent that we are these days, for sure. Another challenge is other pregnancies. Women in your life who make pregnancy announcements or who say, hey, guess what? I'm pregnant, when they know you're going through IVF, or invite you to a baby shower that you don't want to go to because it's quite painful for you. They're the challenges you need to think about and wrap your head around, ideally before you get there, so that you know how you're going to respond to them. And in a perfect world, you address those emotions that you're feeling now. That's ideally what I recommend that you do. Okay, things you can do to support your IVF process. I've already mentioned it a few times. So address your emotions. The sooner you address how you're feeling about this whole process, about your infertility diagnosis, about the fact that you tried to conceive for over a year and it didn't happen, the sooner you can address how you feel, the more neutral you're going to feel about this whole process. Make peace with the future, make peace with the past. By that, I mean, it's obvious to make peace with the past. You make peace with the fact that you've been told that you're not fertile or that your body is not doing what you want. Make peace with what's happened to get to this point. And then making peace with the future, from my perspective, is letting go of your attachment to the outcome. And it took me so long to wrap my head around this for me personally when I was going through it, that I had to let go of the attachment of this baby that I so desperately wanted. That can actually stand in your way. When you grasp and hold on to something really tightly, energetically, that actually pushes it the other way. Calm down your nervous system. So it's a well-known fact that when you're stressed, your chances of getting pregnant are reduced. So when you're stressed and you're in fight or flight mode, I'm sure you know what that is, where a tiger's coming at you, adrenaline's going to hit, and you're going to run, right? Generally, we tend not to fight a tiger coming at us. That level of adrenaline increases your cortisol levels, and that will push back fertility, because it's not a time to get pregnant. It's not a time to lie down and have sex when there's a tiger racing for you. So we want to calm down your nervous system. Our world right now sets up high levels of adrenaline and high stress levels, which are not conducive to pregnancy. So learning how to handle your emotions and regulate your stress levels can support you in making space for the baby, making space for the pregnancy you want, creating the right environment around you. So creating a really supportive environment supports you through the process. Let me just double check my notes to make sure I catch everything and I don't miss anything. Oh yeah. So connecting to your baby energetically. It's a beautiful thing to do. It's a process I have created in my programs, a way to support women to connect to their baby and feel really like this baby's going to come to being as much because I can feel him or her. I felt my 2 children before I became pregnant with them. I know it sounds strange, but I did. I was very clearly connected, especially to my eldest, because I believe I held that connection for so many years. I was very attached energetically, not necessarily to the outcome, but I was attached to her energetically. I could feel her and I connected with her frequently. Oh yes, that's the other thing with creating the right environment, clearing the unconscious beliefs and sabotages. So what that means is often what happens in our subconscious or our unconscious, we believe things that we may not even know that we believe. And those beliefs, the things that you're thinking that may stand in your way will get in your way. Sorry, let me correct that. Things that you don't even know you're thinking, things that you believe about who you are and who you've been, those sorts of things can get in your way. For example, give you an example to make it clear. I was working with someone and she believed that the process of IVF wouldn't work for her. So can you see how she'd have blinkers on when she believes this process won't work? And it wasn't a thought that she thought consciously. It wasn't she was thinking, oh my God, this is not going to work. It was happening at an unconscious level. So there's a part of her that believed this is not going to work for me. She didn't think that, but there were like the blinkers on. Whenever it would come up, she wouldn't see it. She wouldn't see something and it would stand in her way. It's a little hard to describe without going through it in real detail. Let me give you one more example and see if that describes it better. If you think that your body has let you down by the fact that you are in this place of needing IVF, that there may be a sabotage in that you don't believe that your body can do this thing called pregnancy. And that's a sort of belief that I recommend that you shift that you change it, that you move it to a completely different place, a neutral place where you can trust your body. That creates the right environment for this process to work. And then my last thing I recommend that you can do is get the right support. So make sure you've got a support system set up that is going to be there for you every single step of the way through the IVF process. It can be a very, very lonely journey doing IVF. If you have never experienced it, which I'm imagining you are if you're listening to this masterclass, it's exceedingly lonely going through this. You feel like no one else is having to do this in your world. And a lot of women will reach out on social media to other women. And that's amazing. But there's more you can do to support yourself. You could get someone like me to help you. You could rely on your partner. You could make sure you've got a strong support network through your friends, through your colleagues, through whatever it is, whatever way you create that support network that will hold your hand all the way through. For me personally, I had my kinesiologist that I worked very closely with, and I had a very close friend and a family member. And they were the only people who knew, apart from my husband, that we were going to do IVF the first time. No one else knew about it. I went overseas for my egg donation, and we didn't tell anyone we're doing it except for those 2 people. So no one else knew, and it meant there was no pressure on me to meet an ideal of anything. When I went back, so I obviously had, as I said before, I had my first child after my first transfer, went back for a second transfer, and we took our then toddler with us and that family member to work through that second transfer. That was a very stressful process, and everybody back home knew that we were attempting to get pregnant that time. I can safely say the whole thing was really stressful doing it that way. Everyone knowing had to be told that it wasn't successful. And also we had to manage our child in a foreign country, in a foreign hotel, who didn't sleep well. I wouldn't recommend doing any of it that way in hindsight. But what I'm getting at is if you've got the right support in place, you can then feel like you've got it. I ended up going back for my third transfer by myself, left my husband and my child at home for the week while I went and did it all by myself overseas. And that turned out to be perfect. It was perfect because I felt like they were in their home environment. There was very little stress there for them. And I was able to just focus on me and my now son. So that's all those things I highly recommend that you do to support yourself through the process. You're spending a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of commitment of yourself to the process. Make sure you give it everything, not just the physical turning up and showing up to your procedures, but make sure you've got that the framework in place to give yourself the best chance possible. So I'm going to put it to any questions. For anyone who's got anything, shoot me an email at contact@biancacampbell.com. That's Bianca, B-I-A-N-C-A, Campbell, CAMPBELL.com. If you've got any questions about any of the information, or, you know, put a comment in at some stage and ask me any questions that you've got, and I'll feel really happy to answer them. Thanks very much for joining me. I look forward to speaking to you again another time. Bye.